All right, 13.2, I'd like to talk a little bit about religious landscape. So there's a lot of things you could study to try to get more familiar with religion. I think one of the best ones from a practical perspective of, hey, I want to understand my coworkers, is to at least just have a basic understanding of sort of the map of religions across the world. What are the biggest religions? What ones tend to be strongest in which areas, and so forth. So from that perspective, first of all, we can approach it from a numbers perspective. Christianity is the largest religion. About 1 in 3 human beings is Christian at about 2.2 billion. This was, again, 10 years ago. Islam is the next largest, almost the same size at 1.6 billion, and likely to overtake Christianity in terms of numbers of people within this century if current trends continue. Hinduism, very large as well, 1 billion or 15% of human beings. So I think that makes like 1 in 8 human beings. Buddhism, 500 million or half a billion, very, very large. Judaism, 14 million, which isn't nearly as large, but that would be a significant percentage of people of Jewish descent live within the United States. And so that's a very important one to understand as well. You also have other categories like, quote, folk religionists. I always hate when surveyors do that category because that's really like thousands of different religions. That's like indigenous religions, basically. And so that's thousands of different potential religions. So it's a bit of a vague category, but folk religionists and so forth. And within those categories, several of the biggest ones we just talked about are what we would call world religions. So world religions is a term we use to talk about a handful of the religions which are either the largest by population or the ones that are maybe slightly smaller like Judaism or Zoroastrianism, but very, very influential. They've shaped other religions, they've shaped specific empires at specific times. So these are religions that are large and in charge, so to speak, that they are powerful either by size or by historic influence or by both. Most of these religions have at one point or another been associated with a powerful empire, whether it's the Roman Empire, whether it's the Kingdom of Israel, in the BCE, whether it's the various empires within India and the modern state of India. All of these at one point or another, or most of these, have been associated with a powerful empire or group. But, we sometimes look at those world religions, and, when I say a handful, there's different scholars will disagree about which ones count, but there's about 8. We'll sometimes look at those different religions and think, well, I've studied all of them. I went to the Wikipedia page for 5 minutes. Just kidding. I studied all of those 8, and therefore I've studied all the religions. But, I'm here to tell you, you really haven't. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of different religions when you count how diverse each of those religions is. There's many kinds of Islam, there are many kinds of Christianity, there are many kinds of Hinduism. And then when you count the fact that there are thousands of different indigenous groups, each of which prior to colonialism, and some of them still today, have their own belief systems. And also when you combine that with the fact that you've got new religions popping up all the time, think, for example, of the rising up of realism within the last few decades, or ISKCON, the Hare Krishna movement, as it's sometimes called. So new religions are forming all the time. So there really are thousands of religions. You can't study all of them. Just mathematically, it's impossible. You can study many of them, and certainly I enjoy to. You probably won't ever study all of them, at least not in significant depth. Nonetheless, even just knowing kind of how they're grouped can be really helpful in understanding the people around you. So again, we have the world religions, and within the world religions, we have several different groups. And then within each of those groups, you have several different denominations or sects. So, for example, you have Hinduism, but within Hinduism, you have many different movements depending, among other things, on which god is being venerated, such as people who are Vishnites, who venerate Vishnu, people who specifically venerate Krishna, which is an avatar of Vishnu, people that specifically venerate Shiva, Shivites, and many other smaller groups as well. Within Christianity, you, of course, have Catholicism, for example. You have Eastern Orthodoxy. Here in Alaska, we have a rather large percentage of branch of Eastern Orthodoxy called Russian Orthodoxy, as you're probably familiar with. And we even have groups like the Old Believers here on the peninsula who are, in turn, a branch from Russian Orthodoxy. You have the Protestant denominations, which that itself, you could really kind of break that apart into evangelical groups, mainline Protestant groups, liberal Protestant groups, several different groups, and even each of those then into further divisions like Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, and then even that, Southern Baptist, Northern Baptist, Reformed Baptist, and so forth. And so, these world religions are really diverse internally, but they are the world religions. You then have the indigenous religions, which again, there's thousands, because every culture prior to many cultures today practice a world religion. But prior to that, all cultures had their own indigenous religion, some of which became very large and became world religions, such as Judaism and Hinduism. But every culture historically had an indigenous religion, and many cultures still do today, such as the Zande witchcraft system. And then you have other religions which really don't fit in either of those categories, such as Wicca or other neo-pagan movements. And so a lot of religious diversity, but those are kind of three basic categories to think of them through. The world religions, by the way, when you look at them, are kind of interesting in the sense that they actually started all of them within a pretty narrow sliver of the world, right? This kind of Middle East, South Asia, East Asia. That's really it. If we count Shinto, which some people would, we would have to include Japan. If we included pre-Christian Yoruba practices, which influenced things like Vodou and Santeria here in the Americas, we'd also have to include a little piece of East Africa. But for the most part, the vast majority of the world religions, all the ones that are sort of universally agreed upon, are really within these three regions of South Asia, the Middle East or Southwest Asia, and then China/East Asia. And so that's pretty interesting if you think about it. And one of the things to think about also is that all of these religions, with a couple of notable exceptions like Islam, had some kind of either started within about 1000 BC to 0, or they experienced drastic change that kind of led to their current look within the time period of about 1000 BC to about 500 AD. So you had huge religious change and new religions being born within this same time period. And you kind of ask yourself what was going on and why this specific place. And one of the things is that the religions were affecting each other, right? You can't understand all these religions without understanding Hinduism. They were evolving in response to each other. But another thing is that all of these regions where they started, these are all agricultural civilizations which early on developed agriculture, which means that early on they developed large groups of people staying in cities together, developing religious leaders who didn't have to be, could be a full-time religious leader, and also developed writing, right, which allows for texts, holy texts. And so that's at least part of what led to the rise of world religions, certainly, right? Virtually all of these world religions starts with a holy text. So it kind of makes sense actually from that perspective that they would arise in this part of the world, although interesting that we don't have something comparable from this part of the world, which also had writing systems, and several other places as well. Again, this is a map of sort of different groups within Islam, just to suggest that each of these religions, you might think like, well, I understand Christianity, I understand Islam. Each of them are very diverse within them, having groups which may disagree on any number of significant issues. For example, with Islam, as a sort of central issue that structures Islamic diversity today is sort of how Islamic practices should relate to broader society, right? So you have groups even within a single nation that would differ profoundly on that, such as within Turkey, right? Groups that, just like Christianity in the US, groups that would like to see the majority religion play more of a prominent role in politics, and people who think it really has no place in politics, even though it's important to them individually. And so religions are diverse, Islam is diverse, every religion's diverse. And then, of course, you have the indigenous religions. And, I think there's a tendency sometimes to kind of group these. So, for example, people will sometimes ask me, as somebody that studies Native American religions, oh, what do Native Americans believe about X, right? About reincarnation, for example. And, the response you inevitably have to give to that is, well, which ones, right? There are thousands of different Native American groups historically that are you can group into about 300 different cultures in the United States and Canada and Greenland. And, each one has and had their own belief system, sometimes multiple belief systems that changed over time. And, there's common themes, but also a lot of diversity. So, for example, here in Alaska, Native groups prior to Christianization and colonialism each had their own sacred lifeway, and many still do. And those sacred lifeways, for example, tend to have themes of respect of animals, the idea that if you do respect animals, that the animals you need to hunt will return back to the community and be hunted the next year, whether because of reincarnation or just that the animals in general will know that you're a respectful person. A sense of listening to elders is certainly common, a sense that there was a sacred time where animals and humans were more closely connected than they are today. There's some common themes that you find in several of the Alaska Native cosmologies. At the same time, there's huge diversities, right? So, for example, Dena'ina culture here on the peninsula and in Anchorage, primarily in Cook Inlet, there's a lot of different Dena'ina beliefs that are really different than Yupik beliefs or Inupiat beliefs, such as Dena'ina beliefs pre-Christianity about Quetzaltanen, which means the true believer, the idea of certain people that kind of go on a quest to develop their spiritual understanding of the cause and effect of the universe so that they can develop things like shamanic gifts, and this idea of like true belief and the idea of replicating Dena'ina culture in the exact same way generation after generation after generation is kind of a uniquely Dena'ina idea. There's reverberations other places, but it's definitely sort of a Dena'ina take on things. You even have groups like the Dene and the Hopi who live next door to each other, very much so. The Hopi reservation and Navajo reservation. The Navajo reservation literally surrounds the Hopi reservation, and there's common themes, but the religions in some ways kind of be more different, with Hopi religion being really collective, like the whole village comes together and does these huge masked dances that celebrate the ancestor spirits, the Kachsim-nam, whereas Navajo religious ceremonies, although there are dances like that, there's a lot of sort of at the family level or village level ceremonies that are done for a specific individual person, with sand paintings and with the focus being on healing, and not so much on things like ancestor spirits at all. So even indigenous religions that are next door to each other can be really, really, really different from each other. So again, the religious landscape is diverse, but knowing a little bit about the big categories like world religion, indigenous religions, and so forth can be helpful in kind of navigating that and kind of understanding your coworkers or family members. At the same time, it's also helpful to remember that sometimes these things are blended together. So for example, Alan Boris has done some really good research on the fact that although many Dena'ina people today identify as Christian, there's still sort of ways in which Dena'ina pre-Christian beliefs and practices sort of manifest in people's, for example, respectful practices while fishing and hunting. And it's the same if we talk about Navajo Christians or any other number of indigenous groups. So religions aren't necessarily an either or thing, right? People, when we look at it, when we take the bird's eye cultural view, cultures often sort of take on new religions, but then sort of bring in some of older religious practices or combine them in fruitful and interesting ways.